How can a king cloaked in splendor choose a life shaped not by power, but by humility, sacrifice, and holiness? Welcome, dear friends, wherever you are listening tonight. Settle into this gentle moment with us, and remember to subscribe as we begin this shared journey of faith and quiet reflection. This is the story of St. Louis, a king shaped by devotion, burdened by responsibility, and transformed through suffering into a witness of justice and charity, whose faith continues to guide hearts across centuries with enduring grace for all souls. Flowing from the quiet invitation of the introduction, the story opens with the gentle dawn of a life that would one day shape a kingdom. Louis was born in the spring of 1214 in the castle of Poissy, a place where the soft murmur of the Seine seemed to whisper promises of both burden and blessing. He arrived not merely as a royal child, but as a fragile soul entering a France still trembling from wars, rivalries, and the uncertain shadows of political unrest. His mother, Blanche of Castile, was a woman of deep faith and formidable strength, and from the very first moment she held her son, she believed he had been given to her for a divine purpose. She wrapped him not only in fine linens but in whispered prayers, teaching him the sign of the cross before he learned words, guiding his tiny hands toward devotion before he could reach for toys. Even as an infant, Louis was surrounded by a world where holiness and authority intertwined in ways that would one day demand every part of him. And long before he understood what a crown was, he could feel the weight of expectation hovering like a distant star he could not yet name. Louis's earliest years unfolded quietly, shaped by the rhythms of prayer and the gentle discipline of a court where faith was breathed into every hallway. Blanche, more than anyone else, became the living compass of his young heart. She taught him that power meant nothing without purity, that justice began with humility, and that a king must kneel before he could lead. When she held him in her lap and recited the Psalms, she did so not merely to soothe him, but to form him, trusting that these words would seep into his soul as surely as sunlight into stone. Sometimes, late at night, she walked through the silent corridors of the palace with the child in her arms, praying aloud that he would grow into a man who feared God more than he feared war, who loved truth more than flattery, and who served his people with the tenderness of a shepherd rather than the pride of a ruler. These hopes, whispered into darkness, would shape the quiet foundations of his future reign. Meanwhile, the young prince grew surrounded by reminders that the world waited breathlessly for what he would become. Courtiers bowed deeply when he passed, though he was scarcely tall enough to reach their knees. Clerics spoke of destiny around him as though he were not a child, but a living prophecy. Yet Louis, with wide eyes and soft hands, seemed untouched by the heavy conversations swirling above his head. He was drawn instead to simple things: the hush of the chapel at dawn, the warm flicker of candles trembling in their holders, the gentle cadence of monks chanting prayers he could not yet decipher. Something inside him stirred each time he stood in that sacred space, as though he sensed that life would one day ask more of him than he could imagine, and that the strength to meet it would come not from royal blood, but from the quiet endurance of faith. The bond between Louis and his mother deepened year after year, shaping the young prince's view of the world. Blanche was vigilant, guarding him from harmful influences, teaching him discipline wrapped in tenderness. She corrected him softly but firmly when pride flickered in his eyes, reminding him that even kings must bow before the will of God. She praised him when he showed gentleness to servants or listened attentively to a priest, encouraging his heart to lean toward mercy rather than domination. Under her guidance, Louis began to see goodness not as a noble ideal, but as a sacred duty, something expected of him just as much as courage or leadership. And slowly, the boy began to sense that he was not only being prepared for a throne, he was being formed for a calling far deeper than earthly authority. Even in these early years, small hints of his future sanctity emerged like tiny sparks in a darkened room. Once, when he was still quite young, Louis asked a priest why Christ had chosen to be born in poverty. The priest explained that God wished to be close to the lowly, and Louis nodded with a seriousness far beyond his age. Another time, after watching servants prepare the chapel for Mass, he quietly helped gather scattered candle stubs without being asked, his small hands moving with reverence. These moments, though simple, revealed the shape of a heart already turning toward quiet sacrifice. Yet intertwined with this budding holiness was an unspoken tension, a truth every ruler comes to know. Goodness invites expectations, and expectations invite weight. And even then, something in Louis seemed to sense that his path would never be easy, that holiness and hardship often walk side by side. Life in the royal household was not without unease. France was still healing from conflicts of previous decades, and Louis grew up hearing murmurs of rebellion, disputes among nobles, and fragile alliances that could crumble with a single misstep. Though he did not fully understand these dangers, he felt their presence like shifting winds outside the castle walls. Blanche tried to shield him from these worries, but even a young boy could sense when grown men lowered their voices or exchanged troubled glances in corridors. These impressions settled quietly into Louis's awareness, teaching him early that leadership would require more than devotion. It would demand vigilance, courage, and the painful willingness to carry burdens he had never asked for. As Louis grew toward adolescence, the gentle cocoon of childhood began to thin. Tutors instructed him in the arts of governance, history, diplomacy, and the responsibilities of kingship. Priests deepened his understanding of Scripture, shaping in him a sense of spiritual duty that felt as natural as breathing. Yet the more he learned, the more he understood how vast the expectations before him were. Sometimes he stood at a window overlooking the palace grounds, watching soldiers train in the courtyard or peasants pass through the gates, and he wondered what it meant to be responsible for so many lives. How could anyone be worthy of such a role? How could a young heart, still trembling with uncertainty, carry the hopes of a kingdom? These questions, though unspoken, grew quietly within him, becoming the first gentle threads of the lifelong struggle between humility and authority that would define his destiny. And so the child who had once toddled along the castle floors, clutching his mother's hand, now stepped slowly toward the threshold of a future neither he nor anyone else could fully foresee. The innocence of his youth remained, but it was now intertwined with the dawning awareness that one day soon the crown would no longer be a symbol hanging above him. It would rest upon his very head, firm and heavy, shaping every breath he took. And in those soft, uncertain moments, as he gazed toward the horizon of his unfolding life, the question settled quietly within him. When innocence meets responsibility, what path will the heart choose to follow? Flowing gently from the early stirrings of responsibility that touched the boy's heart, the path ahead widened into a landscape both promising and perilous, guiding Louis toward a moment that would forever alter the rhythm of his life. When his father, King Louis VIII, died unexpectedly in 1226, the news spread through France like a cold wind sweeping through autumn fields, carrying with it fear, uncertainty, and the heavy realization that a 12-year-old boy was now the anointed ruler of a restless kingdom. Louis was still more child than man, with a voice not yet deepened and shoulders too narrow to bear the weight that suddenly pressed upon him. Yet in the echoing halls of the palace, where banners hung solemnly and the murmurs of nobles filled the air with anxiety, the boy stepped forward, not with boldness, but with a quiet, earnest dignity that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than age or experience. It was as though the prayers whispered over him in infancy now rose up inside him, forming a fragile shield against the storm he had not chosen to face. The coronation took place in Reims, beneath the soaring vaults of a cathedral that seemed to embrace heaven itself. For the people who filled the space, it was a moment of trembling hope. They gazed upon the young king, slight in frame, serious in expression, his small hands folded with reverence as sacred oil touched his brow. The crown, too heavy for his tender neck, gleamed as an almost symbolic burden, glinting in the candlelight like a reminder of the trials to come. Yet even as the choir's voices rose in hymns that swelled through the great stone arches, Louis felt a quiet resolve settle within him. He understood that this ceremony was not a celebration of power, but an act of surrender, a giving of himself to the service of his people, however difficult and uncertain that path might be. And when he knelt before the altar, he whispered a prayer that God would protect France, guide his young heart, and grant him the strength to choose goodness even when the world pressed him toward compromise. But the world beyond the cathedral doors was unruly, and the nobles who witnessed his coronation carried ambitions that threatened the stability of the crown. Some believed they could manipulate the youthful king, bending him to their desires, seizing control of territories, and settling personal feuds under the guise of serving the kingdom. Whispers of rebellion danced through the courts of regions far from Reims, stirring unrest that could erupt into violence. Yet Louis was not alone. His mother, Blanche of Castile, stepped forward with a presence both fierce and maternal, wielding wisdom as skillfully as any general might wield a sword. With careful diplomacy, unwavering resolve, and a courage that often surpassed that of seasoned warriors, she navigated treacherous alliances, quelled uprisings, and held the kingdom together with a strength that surprised even her enemies. Many underestimated her, calling her foreign or accusing her of overreaching, but she moved with the determination of a woman who believed deeply in her son's destiny. Within the palace, Louis watched this struggle unfold, his young heart absorbing its lessons quietly. He learned that justice required patience, that leadership required sacrifice, and that mercy, the virtue he cherished most, did not mean weakness. Often he spent evenings in the dimly lit chapel, resting in the stillness between flickering candles, contemplating the fragile peace that hung over the kingdom. He prayed for guidance, prayed for his mother, prayed for his people. There were moments when he felt fear creep into his thoughts like a shadow, whispering that he was too young, too untested, too gentle to steer a nation through turmoil. But in those moments he returned again to the example Blanche had given him since birth. Faith must come first, and from faith would flow the strength he lacked. And so he waited, learned, and listened, allowing the responsibilities of kingship to shape him slowly rather than crush him all at once. As months turned into years, the young king grew steadily into his role. Courtiers who had once dismissed him as a figurehead began to notice a quiet intelligence in his questions, a surprising firmness in his decisions, and a depth of empathy that seemed rare in someone poised to rule. He sought to understand the needs of the poor, listened intently to advisors who spoke with honesty, and turned his gaze toward the laws that governed the land, wondering how he might one day bring greater fairness to those who had long been overlooked. There were afternoons when he walked among the castle gardens, reflecting on the delicate balance between power and responsibility, marveling at how easily a ruler could harm without meaning to, or lead astray without noticing. And slowly, he began to sense that leadership wasn't merely a role bestowed by coronation, but a vocation, one that would ask of him not only wisdom, but continual humility. Blanche remained at his side during these formative years, guiding him with unwavering devotion. She never allowed him to forget that his crown was not an ornament, but a charge, a sacred duty entrusted to him by God. She held him to high standards, correcting him gently but firmly when he acted thoughtlessly, encouraging him when he hesitated, and reminding him that a king must first be a servant if he hopes to lead with righteousness. Sometimes, when the palace grew quiet in the late hours of the night, she would speak to him about virtues more enduring than victory: mercy, gentleness, justice, and purity of heart. These conversations, whispered in the soft glow of lamplight, formed the foundation of Louis's character, shaping him not into a warrior seeking conquest, but into a shepherd seeking to safeguard the souls entrusted to him. Though he grew more confident, Louis still carried the knowledge that he walked a path fraught with dangers. Every choice he made as a young king echoed outward, touching countless lives. Sometimes he felt as though he were standing on the edge of a vast landscape, unsure of where the next step would lead, aware that missteps could bring suffering to his people. Yet it was precisely in this awareness that his faith deepened. Each doubt drove him closer to prayer. Each challenge strengthened his reliance on divine grace. And with every passing season, the soft wonder of childhood slowly transformed into the steady resolve of a ruler who sought not glory, but goodness. As Louis approached adulthood, France began to feel the change within him. The boy who had once looked upon the world with wide, uncertain eyes was becoming a young man whose gaze held clarity, compassion, and an emerging sense of purpose. His kingdom remained fragile, his responsibilities immense, yet something within him, some quiet flame, burned with greater steadiness than before. And as he stepped forward into the next chapter of his reign, one question lingered gently in the air, the same soft question that had hovered over him since childhood. How does a heart shaped by innocence and guided by faith learn to carry the full weight of a crown? Flowing onward from the growing certainty that began to take root in the young king's heart, Louis entered the early years of his adulthood with a calm seriousness that captured the attention of all who served beside him. The boy who had once trembled beneath the weight of a crown was now a young man learning to walk steadily beneath it, not with pride, but with humility that seemed to deepen rather than diminish his authority. France, still fragile from past turmoil, looked to him with cautious hope. And Louis, shaped by the lessons of prayer, discipline, and his mother's unwavering guidance, stepped gently into the fuller responsibilities of kingship, with a heart that sought not dominance, but righteousness. Even in those early years, something in his manner set him apart. He listened more than he spoke, studied more than he commanded, and when he finally did speak, his words carried a sincerity that softened hardened nobles and surprised foreign envoys. This quiet strength became the hallmark of his leadership, laying the foundation for a reign that would later be remembered not for grandeur, but for goodness. One of the first areas where Louis's emerging character revealed itself was in his approach to justice. Many rulers treated the law as a tool for maintaining power, bending it when convenient and enforcing it when profitable. Louis, however, believed that justice belonged to God before it belonged to any king. He began to hold audiences regularly, inviting even the humblest peasants to present their grievances. These gatherings were simple in format, but profound in impact. A king sitting in plain garments, sometimes under the shade of an oak tree, listening carefully to the wounded and the overlooked. He asked questions patiently, examined testimony thoughtfully, and rendered decisions with fairness that astonished many who expected bias or swift dismissal. To Louis, justice was not a public performance, but a sacred duty. Each case was a soul entrusted to him, each ruling a chance to reflect the mercy he had learned from Scripture. Even when the disputes were small, he believed that fairness in small things cultivated peace in greater matters. Gradually, news of his even-handedness spread across the realm, giving rise to the image of a monarch who sought truth as earnestly as he sought prayer. Alongside this devotion to justice grew a deepening compassion for the poor. Louis had always been drawn to the quiet humility of those who lived simple lives, and as his power expanded, so did his desire to ensure their well-being. He visited hospitals regularly, not out of obligation, but out of genuine empathy. He listened to the needs of the sick, offered comfort to the dying, and even served meals with his own hands to those who had nothing. Many within the court found these actions puzzling, even unbecoming of a king, but Louis saw Christ in the faces of the poor. To him, every encounter with them was a reminder that his authority existed not for personal glory, but for service. On certain days, he would walk barefoot through the streets of Paris, visiting the most impoverished neighborhoods without fanfare or entourage. He believed that by removing the physical markers of royalty, he could better understand the daily struggles of his people. Some found his behavior confusing, others found it inspiring. But all agreed that no king in living memory had drawn so near to the poor with such unfeigned humility. The spiritual rhythm of Louis's life became increasingly central to his identity. Daily Mass was as necessary to him as breath, and he prepared for the Eucharist with the solemnity of a monk. He kept fasts strictly, prayed with fervor, and often fell into long moments of contemplation, seeking God's will in all things. His devotion to the Virgin Mary grew steadily, offering him a source of comfort when political trials weighed on him, and a refuge of gentleness in moments of doubt. Some evenings, after long hours of governance, he would retreat into the chapel alone, kneeling in silence before the tabernacle. The stillness of those hours forged a deep interior life, anchoring him in grace and guiding his decisions with clarity. Though he bore the responsibilities of a king, Louis increasingly lived with the heart of a servant. He believed that holiness would strengthen his rule more surely than strategy or force, and he trusted that the path of virtue, though difficult, would lead to lasting peace for his people. Yet even as Louis's piety and wisdom deepened, new challenges rose around him. The nobles, accustomed to wielding influence during his minority, occasionally bristled under the authority of a king who now stood firmly in his own right. Some whispered that Louis's devotion made him naive, that his focus on justice and charity distracted him from political realities. They questioned whether such a gentle-hearted ruler could defend France from threats beyond its borders. These criticisms lingered in the air like shadows, sometimes reaching Louis himself. When he heard them, he did not respond with anger or defensiveness. Instead, he reflected quietly on the limits of human understanding and returned to prayer, trusting that God saw what others could not. Still, he was not blind to the dangers around him. He knew that peace could vanish quickly, that alliances might shift, and that his kingdom depended on more than goodwill. But he believed that integrity formed the strongest armor, and he hoped his example would eventually soften the hearts of those who doubted him. Louis's relationship with Blanche continued to evolve during this period. She remained a guiding presence, but as her son matured, she gradually stepped back, allowing him to make decisions independently. This transition was not always easy for her. She had carried the burden of governance for many years and was deeply attached to the role she had played in shaping the kingdom. Yet she recognized that Louis was ready. She saw in him not only the gentle boy she had raised, but the steady ruler he had become. Their bond deepened into one marked by mutual respect, each recognizing the sacrifices the other had made. Blanche's prayers still surrounded him, but now Louis carried them into his own discernment, distinguishing between her wisdom and the wisdom God placed in his heart. It was during these years that he truly emerged from her shadow, not by rejecting her influence, but by fulfilling it. As France became more stable under his leadership, Louis began to consider policies and reforms that reflected his growing vision for the kingdom. He worked to strengthen royal administration, reduce corruption among officials, and establish clearer systems of justice to prevent abuses of power. He also nurtured peace with neighboring lands, preferring diplomacy over conflict whenever possible. His reign slowly became a tapestry woven with threads of stability, fairness, and compassion, rare qualities in an age often defined by turmoil. But these accomplishments did not lead him to pride. Instead, they stirred in him an even greater desire to align his rule with God's will. And as he looked upon the people entrusted to him, their joys, their struggles, their quiet perseverance, he felt a stirring deep within, a call that seemed to come from beyond the demands of daily governance. It was during these contemplative years that Louis first felt the seeds of a deeper longing, a desire to serve God not only as a just ruler, but as a pilgrim willing to journey far beyond the safety of his throne. Stories of the Holy Land whispered to him in the pages of Scripture, and in the accounts of travelers who returned with tales of sacred places in need of protection. Over time, this longing grew, quiet yet persistent, like a distant bell carried on the wind. And though he did not yet understand where it would lead, he sensed that his life was moving toward a moment when faith and kingship would intertwine in ways that would test every part of him. For now, the question rested softly in his heart, a question that would one day rise into a vow. How far must a king go when his soul longs to serve God beyond his own kingdom's borders? Flowing gently from the quiet, insistent longing that had begun to stir in Louis's heart, the next years of his reign unfolded with a deepening sense of purpose, a slow gathering of spiritual momentum that would eventually draw him far from the safety of France and into the heart of a calling he could neither ignore nor fully understand. The desire to serve God more completely had grown within him, like a flame sheltered beneath the cupped hands of prayer, steady and bright, illuminating corners of his soul he had not yet explored. Though he continued to govern with wisdom and humility, something new had begun to take shape inside him, a yearning not merely to rule with justice, but to offer himself entirely, as though his kingship alone were not enough to satisfy the demands of a conscience shaped so profoundly by faith. It was a longing that came to him in quiet moments, during Mass, in the stillness before dawn, or when he knelt before the crucifix and felt, with sudden clarity, that Christ had given everything and asked nothing less of those who followed him. This longing deepened during a period of grave illness that nearly claimed Louis's life. The sickness came upon him suddenly, like a shadow falling across the brightness of day, weakening him to the point where those around him feared he would not recover. His body trembled with fever, his breathing slowed, and the courtiers gathered around his bedside felt the weight of despair settle over them. Blanche, who had once fought fiercely to protect her young son from all manner of danger, now clung to his frail hand, whispering prayers that the God who had guided him since infancy might spare him again. But Louis, caught between life and death, was strangely calm. He felt as though he were standing at the edge of an unseen world, sensing the presence of something vast and holy just beyond the veil. And in that vulnerable moment, when the limits of his strength became painfully clear, he made a vow that would alter the course of his life forever. If God granted him the grace to rise from this bed, he would dedicate himself fully to the service of Christ in the Holy Land. When the fever finally broke and Louis opened his eyes, the relief that swept through the palace was profound. Yet for the king himself, there was no triumphant joy, only a solemn recognition of the vow he had made. He believed with unshakable certainty that his recovery was a sign, a divine summons that demanded obedience. Thus began the quiet stirring of preparation, a preparation as much of spirit as of strategy. Louis did not rush into the decision with the impulsiveness of youth. Instead, he prayed, reflected, and sought counsel from trusted spiritual advisors. Some urged caution, reminding him of the dangers that awaited in the East, the uncertainties of war, and the fragility of France after years of instability. But Louis recognized that this calling was not born from ambition or desire for glory. It was a deeply personal response to the mercy shown to him in his illness, a mercy he could not repay except through total surrender to God's will. As word of his intentions spread, the reactions were mixed. Many in the court were troubled, fearing the kingdom would fall into chaos in his absence. Nobles whispered among themselves, wondering whether the king's piety had clouded his judgment. Diplomats warned of geopolitical risks. Even those loyal to him questioned the wisdom of such a dangerous undertaking. Yet Louis remained steadfast, his resolve unshaken by doubts or objections. He believed that faith, when genuine, demanded courage, and that a king's duty extended beyond earthly borders. To him, the Holy Land was not merely a distant region, but a living testament to Christ's suffering and triumph. The thought of Christians there struggling under foreign rule tugged at his heart, awakening in him a desire to protect, to restore, to serve. The preparations for the crusade unfolded slowly, shaped by prayer and prudence. Louis sought to strengthen the kingdom before his departure, establishing stable governance, reinforcing alliances, and ensuring that the needs of his people would not be neglected in his absence. Blanche, though fearful for her son, supported his decision with her characteristic blend of faith and realism. She recognized that Louis's vow had grown from a depth she could not deny, a depth shaped by the very spiritual foundations she had instilled in him since childhood. And though the prospect of losing him to the uncertainties of war terrified her, she trusted that God would guide him as he had always done. Meanwhile, Louis's inner life continued to flourish. He fasted more frequently, attended Mass with renewed fervor, and sought confession with humility that impressed even the most seasoned clergy. He found solace in Scripture, particularly in passages recounting Christ's own journey through suffering and sacrifice. Sometimes, as he knelt in the royal chapel late into the night, he felt the weight of his calling settle upon him with both tenderness and gravity. He knew he was not being asked to chase glory or victory. He was being asked to walk the path of obedience, even if that path led through shadow and uncertainty. The peace that accompanied this understanding did not come from confidence in military success, but from surrender to divine purpose. Yet beneath this peace, lay a quiet trembling, a recognition of the immense responsibility he bore. Louis was not only a pilgrim at heart, he was a king whose decisions affected millions. He worried for Blanche, for his children, for the stability of France. He wondered whether his people would understand his motives, or whether they would feel abandoned. These concerns did not weaken his resolve, but they did deepen his awareness of the sacrifices this journey required. It was one thing to risk his own life. It was another to risk the future of his kingdom. Still, he believed that a king who lived by faith must also act by faith, trusting that God would provide where human planning fell short. When the time at last arrived to publicly announce his commitment to the crusade, Louis did so with a clarity that left little room for doubt. He stood before his court with a steady voice and spoke of obedience to God, of devotion to Christ, and of the solemn vow he had made in the shadow of death. Some wept, others protested, but many were moved by the sincerity that radiated from him. It was as though the young king, once shaped so deeply by childhood innocence, now stepped fully into the role of a shepherd, willing to lead his flock even into harsh and distant lands. Those closest to him later remarked that in this moment, Louis seemed touched by something beyond earthly concerns, a sense of purpose that shone through his humility like a quiet, unwavering flame. In the weeks that followed, France buzzed with activity as preparations accelerated. Knights pledged their support, clerics offered blessings, and common folk prayed fervently for the king's safety. But beneath the outward bustle, a deeper transformation was unfolding. Louis's decision marked not only a political turning point, but a spiritual one. The young king, who once wondered how innocence could bear the weight of responsibility, now stepped into a new chapter of his life, where responsibility itself was transformed into an offering of faith. And as he looked towards the horizon, where the distant lands of Christ's passion awaited him, one question settled gently in the hearts of all who watched him. How far will faith carry a king who seeks not victory, but fidelity to the God he serves? Flowing from the solemn resolve that had taken hold of Louis's soul, the great journey toward the east began to unfold with a mixture of anticipation and unease, stirring the entire kingdom into motion. The vow he had made during the quiet agony of illness was no longer an interior whisper, but a living reality, shaping decisions, drawing men to his side, and slowly transforming the rhythm of France itself. The preparations for the Seventh Crusade grew with the steady weight of destiny, rising like waves that could not be turned back once they began to swell. Though the decision had been made from a place of humility and faith, it carried consequences that touched every corner of the realm. Louis felt this deeply, not as a burden that frightened him, but as a sacred trust that demanded the very best of his leadership, his conscience, and his courage. And as he watched ships being constructed along the coast, listened to the clatter of armor in the forges, and heard the prayers of monks offered for the safety of the departing army, he felt within himself a mixture of trembling and peace, the strange and solemn accompaniment of every soul who steps into a calling larger than their own life. The heart of his preparation remained prayer. Louis knew that the crusade was not merely a military venture, but a spiritual undertaking, and he approached it with the same reverence he brought to the Eucharist. He spent long hours in the chapel, asking God for clarity, strength, and the grace to lead without pride. Often he knelt alone at night when the palace had grown silent, the shadows long and still around him. He reflected on the Gospels, especially the passages in which Christ spoke of surrender, sacrifice, and love for one's neighbor. These were the truths he wished to carry with him across the sea. He did not dream of conquest or power in the East. Instead, he longed to serve, to protect, to honor his vow with humility that would reflect Christ more than any earthly achievement ever could. The thought of standing in the places where Jesus had walked filled him with awe, yet he knew that the path to reach those sacred lands would not be easy. It would test his endurance, his judgment, and perhaps even his very identity as a king. Louis shared this interior resolve with only a few, for he understood that many could not see beyond the political risks of the journey. His advisors tried to persuade him to reconsider. Some argued that the kingdom was too fragile, that enemies might seize the opportunity to rise against him. Others presented practical concerns about distance, supplies, or the challenges of warfare in unfamiliar regions. Though Louis listened respectfully, he remained firm. He did not dismiss their fears, but he trusted that God's providence would guide him through dangers that human foresight could not fully grasp. At times, he wondered how to explain the quiet certainty in his heart, a certainty that did not rest on strategy or knowledge, but on the deep belief that obedience to God's inspiration mattered more than the success or failure of the expedition. And this conviction strengthened him, even when doubts crept in during solitary moments, reminding him that faith is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. When the day of departure finally arrived, the port was filled with a mix of somber reverence and fervent hope. Soldiers stood in formation beside their ships, banners streaming in the sea breeze, their armor gleaming beneath the sun. Priests moved among them offering blessings, sprinkling holy water on shields and swords. Families clung to one another, knowing that many who boarded the vessels would never return. Amid this tapestry of emotion, Louis walked quietly through the crowds, offering gentle words, laying his hand on the shoulders of young knights, comforting grieving mothers, and speaking with the calm assurance of one who had surrendered everything to God. His presence did not erase their fear, but it softened it, reminding them that they journeyed under the care of a king whose courage was rooted not in conquest, but in faith. As the ships set sail, the coastline of France slowly receded into the distance, shrinking into a thin line of memory along the horizon. Louis stood upon the deck, gazing out toward the open sea with a heart filled with both longing and solemnity. The rhythm of the waves became a kind of meditation, each rise and fall reflecting the quiet stirring of his soul. He prayed silently for his family, for Blanche, who carried the weight of regency once more, for his children who needed a father, and for the people of France whose lives depended on the stability he hoped to preserve even from afar. He prayed, too, for the Christians in the Holy Land, imagining the struggles they faced and asking God to allow him to be an instrument of comfort, however small. The sea voyage stretched on, and with each passing day, Louis's spiritual focus deepened. He kept the hours of prayer faithfully, read scripture with renewed intensity, and spoke with priests about the nature of suffering, the mystery of vocation, and the meaning of surrender. When the crusading army finally reached Egypt, the atmosphere shifted. The initial landing in Damietta brought a sense of cautious optimism. The city fell quickly, and many believed that God had blessed their mission. Yet Louis did not allow victory to cloud his judgment. He maintained a steady rhythm of prayer, urging the army to remain disciplined and mindful of their higher purpose. Many were moved by his humility, by the way he cared for the wounded, and by his insistence that captured enemies be treated with dignity. Even amid military planning, Louis looked for ways to serve rather than dominate, believing that every action taken in Christ's name must reflect Christ's heart. But the early success soon revealed itself to be fragile. Miscalculations, unfamiliar terrain, and harsh conditions began to erode the army's momentum. Disease crept through the camps, weakening soldiers who had once marched confidently beneath their banners. Supplies dwindled. The heat grew oppressive. The Nile's unforgiving waters rose unpredictably, complicating movement and isolating troops. What had once seemed a divinely favored mission began to feel like a slow descent into hardship. Lewis watched his men suffer with a sorrow that pierced him deeply. He tended to the sick, prayed beside the dying, and urged his commanders to act with caution. But even he, with all his devotion, could not alter the unfolding reality. The turning point came during the disastrous march toward Cairo. The French army became trapped, beset by illness, exhaustion, and coordinated attacks that left them vulnerable and disoriented. Louis fought to maintain order, encouraging his men to hold to courage and faith, but he could not ignore the truth. The crusade was collapsing. He saw friends fall beside him, heard the cries of those who could no longer continue, and felt the crushing weight of responsibility deepen with each passing hour. And yet, through every moment of despair, his heart returned again and again to prayer, clinging to the belief that God remained present even when all seemed lost. That belief became his anchor. As Egyptian forces closed in and defeat became inevitable, Louis found himself standing at the edge of a truth he had never wished to face. The mission he had undertaken with such sincerity had led his army into catastrophe. And still, amid the dust, the heat, and the overwhelming weight of suffering, one question quietly rose in his heart. A question that would carry him into the darkest chapter of the crusade. When faith calls a soul into sacrifice, how does one endure when the path leads not to triumph, but to sorrow? Flowing from the heavy silence that followed the collapse of the march toward Cairo, Louis and his army were drawn into a darkness deeper than anything they had imagined when they first set sail from France. The dreams of restoring hope to Christians in the Holy Land had unraveled beneath the scorching sun, replaced now by confusion, hunger, and the lingering stench of disease that clung to every corner of the camp. The river that once seemed a path toward victory now became a barrier that hemmed them in, trapping them in mud, fear, and exhaustion. Louis felt the weight of every fallen soldier, every broken family, every prayer whispered by those who still hoped for deliverance. Yet even as the world around him crumbled, his heart turned instinctively toward the God who had guided him since childhood. He clung to prayer not as a desperate plea for escape, but as an anchor, believing that even in this desolation, Christ walked beside him. Illness swept through the army with merciless speed. Dysentery afflicted countless men, leaving them weak, feverish, and unable to fight. Louis himself grew gravely ill, his strength draining day by day until he could barely lift his head. His face, once bright with purpose, grew pale, shadowed by suffering he bore in silence. Those close to him begged him to retreat to safety, to seek shelter, to protect the life of the king whose presence alone offered hope. But Louis refused to abandon his men. If they slept on mud, he would sleep on mud. If they suffered hunger, he too would fast. If they faced death, he would face it with them. This unwavering solidarity bound him to his troops in a way that no military triumph ever could. To many, he no longer appeared merely as a ruler, but as a shepherd who refused to leave his flock even as wolves closed in from all sides. The situation worsened when Egyptian forces finally surrounded the French encampment, cutting off all remaining paths to safety. Louis, weakened by fever and pain, knew the end had come. He gathered what strength remained to him and continued to pray, whispering psalms as though the familiar words could hold back despair. One evening, As the sun sank into the haze of dust and smoke, he asked to be carried to the place where the soldiers were gathered, their faces drawn with fear and fatigue. With trembling voice, he offered words of encouragement, not promises of victory, but reminders of faith. He told them that God saw their suffering, that no sacrifice offered in love was ever lost, and that courage wasn't measured by success, but by fidelity. Many wept quietly as they listened, not because their fears had vanished, but because in the presence of their ailing king, they felt a glimmer of dignity returning to them. The final confrontation came swiftly. Surrounded, weakened, and with no escape, the army had no choice but to negotiate surrender. It was an agonizing moment for Louis, not because he feared humiliation, but because he knew what captivity would mean for his men. When the terms were presented, that the king himself must be handed over as a prisoner, Louis accepted with a calmness that astonished even his captors. He understood that offering himself might spare others. And so, with a quiet breath and a heart entrusted fully to God, Louis surrendered, allowing himself to be taken into captivity. As he was led away, the soldiers watched with tears in their eyes, seeing not a defeated monarch, but a man who chose suffering over abandonment, a man whose faith held steady even in chains. The journey into captivity was harsh. Louis was bound, weakened by illness, and forced to walk or be carried under guard through unfamiliar lands. Yet even in this degradation, he refused to let despair claim him. He prayed constantly, reciting the psalms he had learned as a child, letting their ancient rhythms soothe the ache in his mind and body. Sometimes, when exhaustion overtook him, he simply gazed upward at the night sky, trusting that the God who had created the stars would not abandon him now. His captors watched him with a mixture of curiosity and respect, puzzled by his serenity. They had taken many prisoners before, but few had accepted suffering with such gentle dignity. Some even remarked among themselves that there seemed to be a light around him, a kind of quiet radiance that illness and humiliation could not extinguish. Days turned into weeks. The prison conditions were crude, marked by hunger, filth, and the constant threat of violence. Yet Louis remained steadfast. He comforted fellow prisoners, offered prayers for the dying, and encouraged those who felt completely broken. Even with chains around his wrists, he found ways to serve, to uplift, to embody the teachings of Christ. Once, when a guard mocked him for praying, Louis simply bowed his head deeper, offering the insult as a silent sacrifice. Another time, when he saw two prisoners fighting over a scrap of bread, he intervened gently, urging them to remember God's presence even in the darkest places. His voice carried no authority of rank, only compassion, and it softened hearts hardened by fear. Negotiations for his release dragged on, filled with tension and uncertainty. Louis did not pray for escape. He prayed for God's will. He prayed that his people in France would remain safe, that Blanche would govern with wisdom, that his children would grow in virtue. But above all, he prayed that he might remain faithful, that suffering would purify rather than embitter him. In this crucible of hardship, his sanctity deepened. He began to see captivity not as a punishment or failure, but as a mysterious part of the path God had chosen for him, a path that invited him to surrender everything, even royal dignity, into the hands of divine providence. At last, after months of negotiation, a ransom was agreed upon. Louis was released, though at a cost the kingdom could scarcely bear. When he stepped out of captivity, weakened and thin, those who greeted him were struck not by his fragility, but by the unusual peace in his eyes. Captivity had not broken him. It had transformed him. He walked with a humility that was deeper than before, a gentleness shaped by suffering, and a renewed devotion to the God who had remained close to him even in chains. Yet instead of returning immediately to France, Louis made a decision that astonished many. He remained in the Holy Land. He believed his mission was not finished, that the wounds left by the failed crusade could only be tended through service and presence, and so, still bearing the marks of hardship, he turned his steps not toward home, but toward the sacred places he had longed for since childhood. There, in the land of Christ, he sought to rebuild what had been broken, not through force, but through patience, charity, and steadfast faith. And as he walked once more toward the holiness he had risked everything to reach, a new question rose gently in the hearts of those who followed him. What kind of strength grows in a man who emerges from captivity not hardened but sanctified, ready to serve even more deeply than before? Flowing gently from the bitter shadows of captivity, Louis emerged into the blinding light of freedom, with a heart profoundly altered by suffering. The man who stepped out of the enemy's hold was not the same king who had once sailed proudly from France. His body was weakened, his face worn thin, yet in his eyes there glowed a quiet peace that could only have been forged in the fire of trials endured with unwavering faith. Instead of returning home, where comfort, safety, and the loving embrace of his family awaited him, he made a decision that startled both friend and foe. He would remain in the Holy Land. He would stay not as a conqueror or a triumphant crusader, but as a pilgrim king, one who believed that God had not brought him across the sea merely for battle, but for something deeper, a work of rebuilding, reconciliation, and humble presence. And so, still bearing the marks of his ordeal, he turned his steps toward Acre, the last significant Christian stronghold in the region, where the wounded remnants of his army and the anxious local Christians waited for guidance. When Louis arrived in Acre, the people gathered around him with mixed emotions, relief at his return, sorrow at the losses that had come before, and a trembling hope that this king, who had suffered as they had suffered, might help mend what was broken. Louis walked through the streets quietly, observing the disrepair of fortifications, the needs of the poor, and the fragile balance of fear and courage that defined the daily lives of the Christians living there. He felt a deep ache for them, an ache that surpassed the political duties of a monarch. It was the ache of a shepherd who had tasted the pain of captivity and now recognized that countless others lived under constant threat. He vowed silently to offer them not only leadership, but compassion, a presence that sought to protect and uplift, even knowing that the days ahead would be filled with uncertainty. The Holy Land was a place of contradictions for Louis. It was the land of Christ, the land of Gethsemane, and the empty tomb, a land where faith itself seemed to breathe through stones and soil. Yet it was also a land scarred by conflict, mistrust, and the ceaseless struggle between powers far greater than any one man could control. Louis felt this tension deeply, but he did not allow it to paralyze him. Each morning he rose before dawn to pray, bowing his head in the silence of the chapel, letting the faint glow of candlelight illuminate the pages of Scripture. He prayed for wisdom, for the strength to lead with humility, and for the grace to serve even when he felt small before the enormity of the challenges surrounding him. In those early hours of communion with God, he found a peace that sustained him through the difficulties of each day. Louis's first priority was to strengthen the defenses of the Christian settlements. He devoted resources, labor, and his own energy to overseeing the restoration of walls, fortresses, and ports that had fallen into disrepair. Though he had once been a prisoner, he now moved through the construction sites like a servant king, speaking with engineers, encouraging workers, and sometimes lifting stones with his own hands. His presence among them brought a sense of renewed purpose. The soldiers who had survived the disastrous campaign felt their spirits slowly rising as they saw their king working beside them, not commanding from afar, but sharing in their efforts. It was not military glory they found in him now, but steadfastness. And it was this steadfastness, more than any victory, that began to rebuild their hope. Yet Lewis's mission in the Holy Land extended far beyond the practical work of fortification. He felt compelled to bring comfort to the spiritual wounds left by the failed crusade. He visited churches where priests struggled to minister to congregations worn thin by fear. He met with local Christian families who had lost loved ones, offering words of consolation, listening to their grief, and praying with them in small homes lit by flickering oil lamps. He gave generously from the treasury to support widows, orphans, and the poor, distributing alms quietly so as not to heap shame upon those receiving them. Many nights he walked through the streets disguised in simple garments, seeking out those who would never dare approach a king for help. In those moments, Louis seemed less a monarch and more a disciple, a man who had learned through suffering the value of compassion that expects nothing in return. One of the most profound experiences during his stay came when he finally visited the holy sites he had so longed to see. Though political tensions prevented him from accessing every place associated with Christ's life, he was able to pray in several sacred locations. When he entered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, his knees trembled, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming realization that he stood within the place where Christ had conquered death. He knelt for a long time, his forehead resting against the cool stone, tears slipping silently down his face as he surrendered again his life, his kingship, and his will to God. It was not triumph he felt in that moment, but humility, a deep awareness that glory belongs only to God, and that the greatest honor one can achieve is faithfulness in suffering. Those who witnessed him that day would later say that the king seemed wrapped in a profound stillness, as though grief and peace had joined hands within him. As months passed, Lewis's influence in the region grew not through power, but through example. Muslim leaders who observed him were struck by his integrity and fairness. Some even spoke of him with respect, noting that he kept his word, refused to treat prisoners with cruelty, and sought dialogue rather than domination. Diplomats who once viewed him as an enemy now saw in him a man whose devotion shaped not only his faith, but his conduct in matters of state. This quiet transformation of perception did more to stabilize the region than any military maneuver could have achieved. Louis had come to the Holy Land expecting to fight. Instead, he found himself called to heal, to mend, to sow seeds of peace in soil long hardened by conflict. Still, the shadow of loss never left him entirely. Louis carried within him a sorrow that deepened with each memory of fallen soldiers, each ruined village, each letter from France filled with news of turmoil or concern. Some nights he lay awake, wondering whether he had misunderstood God's will, whether his vow had led only to suffering without purpose. But in these moments of doubt, he returned again to prayer, reminding himself that faith is not measured by success, but by trust. Christ had endured humiliation, defeat, and death. Why should a king expect to be spared the cross? And so Louis offered even his sorrow as a sacrifice, trusting that God could draw grace from wounds that still ached. After nearly 4 years in the Holy Land, news from France grew increasingly urgent. Blanche, who had faithfully governed in his absence, was aging, and political tensions were rising again. The kingdom needed its king. Louis felt torn between two worlds, the land where Christ had walked and the land entrusted to him from birth. But he knew that duty called him home. He gathered his remaining forces, blessed the people who had stood with him through trial, and prepared to depart with a heart heavy, yet strengthened. And as he set his gaze toward the horizon where the sea awaited, a quiet question whispered through the minds of all who had witnessed his pilgrimage. How does a man carry the lessons of suffering and holiness from the sacred places of exile back into the ordinary burdens of a kingdom awaiting his return? Flowing gently from the long years he had spent walking the fragile soil of the Holy Land, Louis turned at last toward France, carrying within him not the triumphant spirit of a conqueror, but the quiet, tempered soul of a man who had learned holiness through suffering. The sea voyage back to Europe unfolded with a solemn calm, the waves murmuring like distant prayers beneath the ship's wooden hull. As the coastline of his kingdom slowly appeared on the horizon, Louis felt a tender mixture of longing and apprehension rise within him. He had left France as a king eager to fulfill a vow, pressured by the fire of a conscience that demanded action. Now he returned as a man marked by grief and grace, one who understood in a far deeper way that God's will is often revealed not in victories, but in trials that refine the heart. And though the familiar shores drew nearer, he felt a soft trembling in his spirit, for he knew that the kingdom he had left behind would not be the same. And neither was he. When Louis stepped onto French soil once more, the people welcomed him with a bittersweet joy. Crowds lined the streets, eager to glimpse their king whose absence had stretched across years heavy with uncertainty. Yet the man who rode among them did so without fanfare, dressed simply, his face solemn and serene. Those who looked closely saw a new depth in his eyes, a gentleness tinged with sorrow, a steadiness molded by endurance, and a tenderness that had only grown stronger through hardship. He greeted the people with quiet warmth, blessing the children, comforting the widows, and acknowledging the elders whose lives had unfolded patiently in his absence. France felt the presence of their king not through triumphal displays of power, but through an unmistakable sense of spiritual weight, as though Louis carried within him a grace that had been shaped in places and moments far beyond human measure. One of the first tasks that awaited Louis upon his return was reuniting with his mother, Blanche of Castile, whose strength had sustained the kingdom during his sojourn in the East. But the reunion was shadowed by sorrow. Blanche's health had deteriorated, her once unyielding vitality now dimmed by age and the strain of governance. When Louis entered her chamber, he found her seated in a simple chair, wrapped in warm garments, her face pale yet illuminated by a familiar tenderness. She looked at him for a long moment, tears welling quietly in her eyes, as though unable to contain the love and relief that swept through her heart. Louis knelt before her, resting his head gently in her lap, as he had done when he was a small boy frightened by the storms of childhood. Blanche placed her trembling hands upon his hair, whispering prayers of gratitude even as her breath faltered. In that fragile moment, king and mother shared a silence filled with decades of devotion, sacrifice, and faith woven together like threads of a single tapestry. Blanche died not long afterward, leaving Louis with a grief so profound it felt like losing the very compass that had guided him since infancy. Her death marked a turning point in Louis's life. Without her presence to shield him or guide him, he stepped fully into the heart of kingship with a maturity and humility that had been shaped by both captivity and loss. He moved through his palace with the quiet step of someone who carried invisible burdens, yet he also carried an unshakable purpose. He sought not comfort or rest, but renewal, both for himself and for his kingdom. France needed healing as much as he did, and Louis resolved to offer his people the same compassion and dedication that had sustained him through his darkest hours. One of his first initiatives was to re-establish stability in governance. He reviewed laws, corrected injustices, and held court sessions with a fairness that astonished those who expected a king embittered by defeat. Louis was determined that his suffering would not make him hardened or suspicious. Instead, he allowed it to deepen his awareness of human frailty, guiding him toward justice rooted in mercy. He listened attentively to complaints from peasants and nobles alike, aware that even the smallest voice deserved attention. Under his steady leadership, the court became known not for harshness, but for honesty and integrity, qualities rare in any age, but especially rare in a world still shaped by the remnants of feudal ambition. Louis also turned his heart toward rebuilding the moral and spiritual life of the kingdom. France had drifted spiritually during his absence, and he believed that renewal must begin not with edicts, but with example. He increased his personal acts of charity, expanding hospitals, supporting monasteries, and ensuring that the poor had access to bread, clothing, and shelter. He gave alms quietly, often in disguise, seeking to relieve suffering without drawing attention to himself. He encouraged priests to preach with gentleness and clarity, fostering unity within the church at a time when political pressures easily threatened to overshadow spiritual needs. Yet even with these responsibilities, Louis did not neglect his family. His wife, Marguerite of Provence, who had borne the trials of the crusade with steadfast devotion, welcomed him home with a relief that softened her features. They found in each other a renewed partnership, a shared understanding that the sorrows they had endured had woven their souls together more tightly than ever. Their children, many of whom had grown in his absence, now circled around him with a mixture of curiosity and reverence, sensing that the father who had returned was different from the one who had departed. Louis offered them not only affection, but guidance, praying with them, teaching them the virtues he cherished, and encouraging them to live with humility and courage. These quiet domestic moments, often overlooked in the grand chronicle of history, were among the most precious to him. They grounded him in the simple daily rhythms of love, rhythms that softened the harsher edges of kingship and reminded him of the gentle humanity Christ himself embraced. Still, the kingdom remained fragile. Many nobles had grown accustomed to greater autonomy during his absence, and some harbored resentment toward Louis's renewed involvement in governance. But Louis met their challenges not with anger, but with patient firmness. He believed that unity required understanding, not force, and he sought to rebuild relationships through dialogue and fairness. It was not easy, and at times he felt the weight of resistance press heavily upon him. Yet he never allowed bitterness to take root. He viewed every conflict as an opportunity for grace, every disagreement as a chance to practice humility. Gradually, the kingdom began to feel the effects of his gentle strength. Roads became safer, laws more consistent, and poverty less overwhelming. The people increasingly came to see in him not only a ruler, but a father, a man whose leadership sprang from compassion rather than ambition. And Louis, in turn, felt his heart slowly heal as he poured himself into service. Though the memories of defeat and captivity remained, they became sources of wisdom rather than shame. He understood now that God had allowed him to suffer so that he might better understand the suffering of others, and he carried this understanding into every decision he made. As seasons passed, Louis's reign entered a period of calm, marked not by sweeping triumphs, but by steady, quiet labor, the kind of labor that often goes unnoticed, yet strengthens the very foundations of a nation. And from this calm arose a gentle, lingering question in the hearts of all who observed him. After all the trials he had endured, how would this king, shaped by sorrow, refined by captivity, and guided by unwavering faith, continue to lead his people toward a future touched by justice, mercy, and peace? Flowing gently from the renewed peace that had begun to settle over France, Louis entered a season of life marked not by war or grand public triumph, but by the quiet, intricate work of shaping a kingdom through relationships, faith, and the steady presence of love. His return from the Holy Land had softened him in ways that radiated through every sphere of his life, especially within his own household. The court, once accustomed to the bustle of politics and diplomatic intrigues, now found itself infused with a gentler atmosphere, one shaped by the king's deepened spirituality and the humility he carried from years of suffering abroad. And so, in these calmer days, Louis turned his heart toward nurturing the bonds that made life meaningful, his marriage, his children, and the friendships that sustained his spirit even amid the complexities of rule. If the Holy Land had taught him endurance through suffering, these domestic years would teach him the delicate art of love, a love lived not in grand gestures, but in small, faithful acts that shaped the rhythm of every day. Marguerite of Provence, Louise's beloved wife, had waited with extraordinary patience through his long absences and dangerous journeys. When he returned from captivity and from his service in Acre, she welcomed him not with reproach or bitterness, but with quiet relief, as though his presence alone restored a missing piece of her soul. Their relationship, built over many years, deepened further as they found themselves able to share daily life again. Louis spoke to her in the evenings about the people he had met in the Holy Land, the prayers that sustained him in captivity, and the moments of grace that had helped him endure. Marguerite listened with a tenderness that reflected her own strength, a strength often overlooked by history, but deeply known by her husband. She had weathered loneliness, diplomatic pressure, and the strain of governing in his absence. Yet she had remained steadfast, her love rooted in faith rather than expectation. Louis cherished her increasingly, aware that his own journey had been possible only because she had sustained the kingdom behind him. Their home life blossomed in quiet, intimate ways. Louis took joy in watching their children grow, each bearing traces of both parents, the intelligence of their mother, the gentleness he hoped came from himself, and the spirited determination of youth unburdened by the trials of war. He often gathered them around him, telling them stories from Scripture, guiding them through moral dilemmas, and teaching them that leadership, at its heart, was service. Even the youngest listened with wide, solemn eyes, sensing that their father spoke from a place shaped not only by authority, but by tenderness born of suffering. These moments strengthened Louis's resolve to guide his children toward lives shaped by integrity, humility, and devotion to God. He encouraged them to pursue education, prayer, and charity, believing that the truest legacy he could leave was not a stronger kingdom, but children whose hearts reflected God's love in their own ways. Louis's friendships also played a vital role in his life during these years. He maintained close relationships with clergy, monastic communities, and trusted advisors who shared his desire for a kingdom grounded in justice and faith. Among these were friends who had accompanied him on the crusade, men who had witnessed his suffering firsthand and whose loyalty had been shaped in the crucible of hardship. They spoke openly with him, offered counsel without fear, and helped him discern the delicate matters of governance. Louis valued their honesty, especially in a court where flattery was common. He often sought their company in the evenings, discussing matters of faith, scripture, or the struggles facing the kingdom. These conversations offered him a kind of companionship that eased the loneliness that sometimes crept into the heart of a man destined to rule. For although he was loved by his people, the responsibility of kingship often placed him at a distance from others, a distance bridged, in part, by these friendships grounded in mutual respect and spiritual unity. Yet not all relationships within the court were simple or harmonious. Louis's unwavering commitment to justice, honesty, and moral integrity created tension among nobles who preferred the ways of convenience and self-interest. Some resented his reforms, which curtailed abuses of power and demanded accountability from those who had long acted without restraint. Others bristled at his expectations of uprightness, finding his piety excessive or impractical. They whispered behind closed doors that Louis was too rigid, too idealistic, too devoted to principles that did not always suit the shifting complexities of politics. Louis heard these murmurs, but he bore them with quiet patience. He knew that righteousness often invites criticism, and that a leader who seeks to serve God cannot bend his convictions to appease those who pursue only their own gain. Instead of responding with anger or retaliation, he continued to lead through example, hoping that the light of virtues lived consistently would soften the resistance that words alone could not overcome. Louis's dedication to fairness extended especially to matters involving those closest to him. He often mediated disputes between nobles, insisting on transparency even when doing so risked tension. He invited opposing parties to speak openly in his presence, trusting that truth would emerge when given the chance to be heard without intimidation or manipulation. These sessions were sometimes long and complicated, yet Louis approached them with a patience shaped by prayer. He believed that justice required time, attention, and compassion, and he was willing to give each generously. And though his decisions did not always please everyone, they often brought peace to situations previously burdened by resentment or confusion. Within the intimate spaces of family life, Louis demonstrated a fatherly gentleness that contrasted with the public dignity expected of a king. He played with his children, walked with them in the gardens, and listened attentively to their questions about faith and life. He shared with Marguerite the joys and sorrows of parenting, the small triumphs of their children's growth, and the tender worries that accompanied each new stage of their lives. At times he felt the weight of knowing that his sons would one day bear the responsibilities of leadership, and he sought to prepare them not through strict authority, but through patient guidance. For his daughters, he wished futures filled with dignity and purpose, ensuring that they were educated, respected, and supported in ways that reflected their inherent worth as children of God. Yet, even in these peaceful years, Louis knew that life's trials had shaped him too deeply to allow complacency. He continued his disciplined life of prayer, fasting, and service. He joined monks during liturgical celebrations, sought counsel from spiritual directors, and maintained a connection to the poor through frequent acts of charity. He believed that holiness must be lived daily, not achieved in isolated moments of heroism. Sometimes Marguerite would watch him praying silently in the chapel late at night, the candlelight illuminating his bowed head, and she would feel both pride and sorrow, pride for the goodness that radiated from him, and sorrow for the weight of devotion he carried so unwaveringly. She loved him for this very fidelity, yet she also sensed the loneliness that occasionally touched his spirit as he walked the narrow path of virtue. Amid all these responsibilities, relationships, and acts of devotion, Louis continued to search his heart for wisdom. He wondered how best to guide his children into adulthood, how to protect France from future threats, and how to foster unity in a kingdom often pulled apart by ambition. These questions lingered within him, stirring reflections that reached into the deepest places of his soul. And as he moved gently through these peaceful yet complicated years, one question rose quietly within the hearts of all who watched him. How long could a king who loved so deeply and governed so tenderly continue to carry the burdens of a world that did not always welcome the purity of his intentions? Flowing gently from the tender quietude of family life and the delicate harmony of relationships that Louis had worked so patiently to cultivate, the next chapter of his reign unfolded like a slow-turning page, revealing a deeper, more complex struggle. One fought not on battlefields or in distant lands, but within the corridors of his own kingdom, where human ambition, pride, and misunderstanding often cast long shadows over his pursuit of holiness. These were not dramatic conflicts that stirred the masses into open revolt, nor were they the explosive clashes of armies meeting under a blazing sun. Instead, they were subtle, persistent tensions, whispers in the background, murmured discontent among nobles, political maneuverings concealed beneath gestures of loyalty, all aimed at challenging a king whose moral integrity was as unyielding as it was uncomfortable for those accustomed to the freedoms of power. And Louis, whose heart sought truth even more fiercely than victory, found himself navigating these hidden storms with the same gentle courage that had sustained him through captivity, though now the wounds inflicted were less visible and often more personal. At the core of these tensions was a truth Louis understood with painful clarity. Holiness requires consistency, and consistency makes demands that many find burdensome. His court had long been accustomed to the indulgences, shortcuts, and silent agreements that allowed life to run smoothly within the layers of power. But Louis believed that justice must be transparent, that laws existed to protect the weak rather than enrich the influential, and that authority gained meaning only through service. These convictions shaped his governance in ways that some nobles considered excessive. They watched uneasily as he enforced reforms that limited their privileges, held them accountable for abuses of power, and insisted on fairness in matters where influence once guaranteed favorable outcomes. To Louis, these reforms were acts of fidelity. To those who had benefited from the older ways, they were threats. The murmurs began quietly at first, hushed conversations behind closed doors, veiled criticisms disguised as concern. Some nobles claimed that Louis's piety was blinding him to the practicalities of governance. Others argued that he spent too much time on charitable works and not enough on diplomacy. A few accused him of trying to impose monastic discipline on a realm that did not share his spiritual zeal. Though these complaints varied in tone and intensity, they all pointed toward a deeper resentment. Louis's integrity, admirable as it was, exposed the shortcomings of those around him, and human nature often rebels against the light that reveals its shadows. Louis was no stranger to criticism. He had faced it since his youth. Yet now, as a mature king who had walked through suffering few could imagine, he felt the sting more deeply than before. He was not wounded by insults to his character, but by the realization that his attempts to bring justice and mercy to France were being met with suspicion rather than gratitude. Still, he did not allow these reactions to harden him. He reminded himself, often in the silent hours of the night, that Christ too had been misunderstood, that the pursuit of righteousness had always been accompanied by misunderstanding and opposition. And so Louis continued his reforms with patience, trusting that time would reveal the purpose behind his actions. One of the most contentious issues concerned his efforts to curb corruption within the legal system. Louis believed deeply in the importance of fair trials, honest judges, and procedures that upheld the dignity of every person, whether noble or peasant. He established inquiries into injustices, replaced officials who exploited their roles for personal gain, and sought to eliminate the practice of bribery. Many welcomed these changes, grateful for a king who listened to their sufferings. But those whose influence had depended on manipulating the system for their own benefit found themselves increasingly threatened. They began to speak more openly against the king, claiming that he was weakening the traditional structures of power. Even some who admired his integrity feared that the kingdom might become vulnerable if the nobility grew discontented. Louis felt this pressure, but he refused to compromise. He believed that moral integrity was more durable than political convenience. He sought counsel from trusted advisors, prayed deeply for discernment, and acted with a deliberateness that left no room for impulsive decisions. Yet even when he knew he was acting rightly, he felt the loneliness of being misunderstood. There were evenings when he walked the quiet halls of the palace, sensing the invisible currents of disapproval swirling around him. And in those moments, he would slip into the chapel, kneel before the tabernacle, and ask only for the grace to remain faithful. His prayers were not filled with demands for vindication. They were filled instead with the simple request that God strengthen his heart to endure whatever challenges lay ahead. Even within his own family circle, Louis sometimes encountered resistance. His wife, Marguerite, loved him dearly, yet she occasionally struggled to understand the full intensity of his devotion. She admired his commitment to the poor and his unwavering honesty, but she also worried that his ideals might place unnecessary burdens on the royal household or expose the kingdom to risk. Some days she wished he would rest more, compromise more, or allow himself to enjoy the pleasures of life without feeling compelled to offer everything as sacrifice. Louis listened to her with tenderness, acknowledging her concerns, yet he could not abandon the path he believed God had set before him. These gentle tensions never fractured their marriage, but they revealed the challenge of being bound to a man whose heart beat with a rhythm shaped not by worldly comforts, but by spiritual longing. Louis's children, too, observed these struggles. As they grew older and became more aware of court politics, they saw the toll that criticism took on their father. Yet they also witnessed his extraordinary patience, his refusal to respond with anger, and his unwavering trust in God. These lessons etched themselves into the forming contours of their young hearts, shaping their understanding of leadership not as control or domination, but as service and sacrifice. Louis often took time to speak with them about spiritual matters, guiding them gently through questions of conscience and faith. He believed that their future roles, whatever they might be, would require a foundation built upon humility, compassion, and courage. Through his example, he taught them what no tutor could: that true strength comes not from power, but from integrity lived consistently even when misunderstood. Despite the tensions within the court, Louis remained beloved by the common people. They saw in him not a distant monarch, but a father who cared for their needs. They witnessed his acts of charity, heard of his fairness in trials, and felt the peace brought by reforms that protected their livelihoods. Yet even the gratitude of the people could not fully ease the hidden burdens he carried. Leadership, he understood, was a cross, one he accepted willingly, but not without the quiet ache that comes from bearing responsibility for millions of souls. As the years passed, the criticisms did not disappear, though they shifted in tone. Some who had once mocked his piety began to admire it silently. Others who had resisted his reforms reluctantly accepted their benefits, and still others continued their murmuring, unable to reconcile themselves to a king who lived with such unwavering moral clarity. Through it all, Louis walked the narrow path between justice and mercy, guided by a conscience that refused to bend. But as pressures mounted, A new restlessness began to stir within him, a gentle, persistent question that echoed through his prayer. Had he fulfilled the vow he made years before, or was there still something unfinished in the depths of his soul? It was a question that would soon lead him toward another decision, one that would surprise many and test him in ways he had not yet dared to imagine. For even in the calm of his mature reign, a sacred tug pulled at him, whispering softly of a path he had once walked under scorching sun and bitter captivity. And all who observed him, family, friends, and critics alike, began to sense that something within the king was shifting once more, preparing for a turning point that would shape the final chapters of his earthly journey, flowing gently from the quiet restlessness that had begun to take root in Louis's heart. The next chapter of his life unfolded with a solemn inevitability, as though a gentle but unyielding hand were guiding him once more toward a path he had not fully chosen, yet could not refuse. Years had passed since his return from the Holy Land, years in which his kingdom had prospered beneath his steadfast governance, and peace had settled over France like a warm mantle stretching across fields, churches, and bustling marketplaces. Yet even as harmony grew outwardly, a deeper stirring pressed upon Louis's spirit, a longing that had first whispered to him in those dim hours of captivity, and had never fully fallen silent. It came to him during prayer, during moments of quiet reflection, and even in the midst of his responsibilities. It was not a command or a thunderous revelation. It was simply a soft, persistent ache within him, the sense that he had left something unfinished, that his vow to God had not been completely fulfilled, and that the burden of gratitude he carried for his restored life still sought expression through sacrifice. Louis fought this interior pull silently for a long time. He knew, better than anyone, the cost of crusade, the suffering, the death, the uncertainty. He remembered the anguish of starving soldiers, the bitter defeat, the humiliation of captivity, and the sorrow he had carried for every life lost. Part of him hoped that God might accept what he had already offered. Another part knew that sacrifice, once tasted deeply, leaves a mark upon the soul that cannot be ignored. And so he prayed, sometimes until dawn, asking for clarity, for peace, for understanding. But the longing did not lift. Instead, it grew, wrapping itself around him with the weight of a quiet vocation. At times he felt torn between his love for France, his duties as a father and husband, and the promise he had once made in the fragile borderland between life and death. Yet, no matter how he wrestled with the question, the same truth always resurfaced. He could not deny the call stirring within him. It was during one of these long nights of prayer, kneeling alone in the dim glow of the chapel, that Louis finally understood. He sensed within himself, not through words, but through a profound interior clarity, that God was inviting him to embark once more upon the path of pilgrimage. Not for conquest, not for glory, not even for victory, but for obedience, penance, and the fulfillment of a vow that had shaped the contours of his life. The decision brought with it no triumph, only a grave, quiet peace. Louis knew the road ahead would be hard, that many would oppose him, that even those he loved might not understand. Yet he felt certain that he must go, and so, with a heart trembling yet resolute, he whispered his fiat, a yes offered as humbly as the one he had spoken years before. When he announced his decision to embark on another crusade, a wave of shock rippled through France. The memory of the failed Seventh Crusade still haunted many. The nobles who had once murmured against Louis's reforms now openly expressed disbelief. Some begged him to reconsider, insisting that France needed stability, not another costly and perilous venture. Others accused him of recklessness, arguing that his zeal blinded him to the practical needs of governance. Even his closest advisors, men who had supported him through war and peace, struggled to accept his choice. They feared that age, fatigue, and the weight of past suffering would make him vulnerable. Yet Louis listened with patience, acknowledging their concerns without wavering. He had not come to this decision lightly. He knew better than anyone the consequences, but he also knew the depth of his vow. Marguerite's reaction was the most painful of all. She had walked beside Louis through sorrow and triumph, through separation and reunion, and she had long hoped that the rest of their years might unfold in the warmth of family life. When Louis shared his decision with her, she felt her heart fracture under the weight of fear and grief. She begged him, with tears shining in her eyes, to remain, not for the sake of the kingdom, but for the sake of their children, their marriage, the tenderness they had rebuilt after so much loss. Louis held her hands gently, his own eyes heavy with sorrow. He did not dismiss her fears. Instead, he tried to share with her the quiet certainty that had taken hold of his soul. But though she listened, her heart could not accept it. The path of holiness that called to Louis was not the one she longed for. And so, a gentle rift opened between them, not born of anger, but of love stretched by grief. Marguerite eventually resigned herself to his decision, but she carried within her a sadness that never fully faded. Louis began preparations with a solemnity that reflected the gravity of what he was undertaking. He was older now, and he knew his strength was not what it had once been. He arranged for the governance of the kingdom in his absence with meticulous care, ensuring that France would remain stable and protected. He spent long hours in prayer, seeking the grace to lead with humility and courage. He consulted with theologians, asking for guidance on how best to unite spiritual devotion with the practical demands of a crusade. He also met with ambassadors and nobles from other lands, hoping to build alliances that would strengthen their cause. Through all these efforts, he remained grounded in the same quiet faith that had sustained him through every chapter of his life. As word of his intentions spread, many ordinary people, peasants, merchants, widows, and clergy, were moved by his resolve. They did not see in Louis a king driven by pride or ambition, but a man whose heart was wholly surrendered to God. Thousands pledged to join him, inspired by his example and longing to support his holy mission. And though some questioned the wisdom of a king embarking on such a dangerous path at his age, countless others saw his decision as a testament to faith, lived with uncompromising integrity. Before his departure, Louis spoke to his children with tenderness, gathering them close within the quiet of the palace gardens. The youngest clung to him, unable to understand why their father must leave again, while the older ones listened with solemn hearts. Louis encouraged them to live with faith, humility, and love, to guide one another, to remain united, and to trust that God would watch over them all. He embraced each of them with arms that trembled slightly, knowing that this farewell carried a weight deeper than words could hold. And though he reassured them that he hoped to return, some part of him sensed that this journey might be the final offering of his earthly life. When the day of departure came, the sky hung low with clouds, as though the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Louis walked slowly toward the ships, surrounded by soldiers, clergy, and pilgrims. His step was steady, but no longer youthful. His face bore the lines of age and sorrow, yet his eyes held a peace that shone softly even through the gathering gloom. Those who watched him felt a mixture of admiration, fear, and awe. They sensed that this man, this king who had suffered, served and prayed with such depth, was embarking not merely on a crusade, but on a final pilgrimage of the heart. And as the ships pulled away from the shore, France fading slowly behind him, a question lingered gently in the hearts of all who saw him off. What awaits a king who chooses once more to walk the path of sacrifice, offering the final strength of his life to the God he has served with unwavering devotion, flowing gently from the solemn moment of departure? The ships carrying Louis and his followers slipped across the gray waters with a quiet steadiness, as though the sea itself understood the gravity of the journey it now bore. Unlike the earlier crusade of his youth, charged with the restless energy of a king seeking to fulfill a vow, this second expedition unfolded beneath the heavy resonance of age, memory, and sacrifice. Louis was no longer driven by impulse or by the bright fire of youthful zeal. He traveled now with the tempered heart of a man who had experienced defeat and humiliation, who had endured captivity and sorrow, and yet who still believed, unwaveringly, humbly, that God was calling him once more into service. Those who stood beside him could sense the difference. Gone were the triumphant banners and the surging hope of anticipated victory. In their place was a quiet determination, a steady resolve, and a profound trust that whatever lay ahead would unfold according to a divine plan greater than human understanding. The journey across the Mediterranean was slow and often difficult. Storm winds rose at intervals, tossing the ships upon restless waves that seemed to echo the inner tremblings of the men on board. Many who had joined Louis believed deeply in the holiness of their mission, yet they also carried the fear of repeating past horrors, fear of disease, of loss, of the unknown dangers waiting in distant lands. Louis moved among them with gentle words and steady presence, encouraging them not with promises of quick triumph, but with reminders of faith, endurance, and the quiet assurance that Christ himself had walked paths lined with suffering. He prayed with them during the long nights at sea, when the horizon vanished into a dark line that separated heaven from earth, and when the murmuring of prayers mingled with the creak of ship timbers and the sigh of wind in the sails. In these simple acts of companionship, Louis became not merely a king leading an army, but a spiritual father guiding souls toward courage. Their destination was not Egypt this time, but the shores near Tunis in North Africa. Louis had been persuaded that establishing a foothold there could strengthen Christian influence, create alliances, and potentially open new paths toward Jerusalem. Yet as the ships neared the coastline, a heavy heat rose from the land like a breath of warning. The sun glared mercilessly upon the sea, turning the air thick and shimmering, coating every movement with exhaustion. The men disembarked with determination, building a camp with the disciplined precision of seasoned soldiers, yet the oppressive climate made even the simplest task feel monumental. The tents sagged under the weight of heat, the water supplies dwindled rapidly, and the wind carried dust that clung to skin and lungs until breathing became an effort of will. Louis, though older and physically more fragile than in his earlier years, refused to rest in comfort while his men suffered. He walked through the camp daily, speaking with soldiers, tending to the wounded, distributing water, and offering encouragement. He visited the sick tents repeatedly, even when advisors urged him to avoid exposure to illness. For Louis, compassion was not a choice to be applied selectively. It was the essence of discipleship. He believed that a king must be the first to embrace sacrifice, not the last to avoid it, and so he stayed close to those who suffered, believing that Christ would meet him in the faces of the sick and dying. Inevitably, the very thing they feared began to spread. Disease, swift and merciless. The scorching heat and unsanitary conditions created a crucible in which illness thrived. Soldiers who had survived the perils of sea and battle now fell to fevers that burned with unnatural intensity. The sick tents overflowed. Cries of pain echoed through the night. As the grim reality of the situation deepened, despair settled over the camp like a suffocating fog. Some questioned whether they had misread the will of God. Others wondered whether they were being punished. Yet Louis continued to walk among them, his face lined with sorrow but shining with an unshakable peace. He spoke softly to the dying, assuring them that God was near even in this desolate landscape. He prayed for them as though each soul entrusted to him were a precious treasure he dared not neglect. As the days dragged on, Louis himself began to feel the first signs of illness, a weariness that clung to his bones, a fever that flickered behind his eyes, and a tightening in his chest that made each breath a struggle. His advisors pleaded with him to withdraw to a cooler, safer place, but he refused. He would not abandon the men who had followed him so faithfully. He believed that suffering shared was suffering sanctified, and that God had allowed him to walk this path for a reason that could not yet be seen. Still, even as he persevered, the illness worsened. Nights became battles against rising heat and piercing pain. Days blurred into long stretches of weakness during which he could scarcely stand. Yet through it all, he continued to pray. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and bathed the camp in a soft, reddish glow, Louis asked to be lifted from his bed and placed upon the ground itself. He wished to lie, he said, in the same dust that covered the feet of his soldiers. Those attending him hesitated, but obeyed his request. And so the king who had once brought peace to France, who had ruled with justice and prayed with humility, rested his weakened body upon the earth, whispering prayers that rose gently into the fading light. He spoke of Christ's humility, of the passion, of the mercy that had sustained him through every chapter of his life. His words drifted through the warm air like a quiet hymn of surrender. That night, as the stars appeared one by one, shimmering above the desolate camp, Louis experienced a moment of profound clarity. He thought of his mother, Blanche, whose prayers had formed the foundation of his faith. He thought of Marguerite, whose love had steadied him through countless trials. He thought of his children, each one a tender gift entrusted to him by God. He thought of the poor, the sick, the prisoners, the pilgrims, the widows, all those whom he had tried to serve with the gentleness of Christ. And as he reflected on these memories, a profound peace descended upon him, soft and luminous, like the touch of grace brushing the edges of his suffering. The following morning, his condition worsened. Fever blurred his vision, and breathing came in shallow, uneven waves. Those at his bedside wept quietly as they watched the king who had been their anchor now teeter on the edge of eternity. Louis asked for the crucifix to be placed in his hands. He pressed it gently against his heart, whispering prayers too soft to be heard, but felt deeply by those who knelt beside him. In these final moments, there was no fear in him, no unrest, only the calm surrender of a soul returning to the God it had loved with every breath. As the heat of the day grew, Louis's strength slowly ebbed away. Surrounded by his faithful companions, he closed his eyes and let his final prayer rise like incense into the still air. His last words, spoken with effort yet radiant with longing, were simple. Jerusalem, Jerusalem. And with that, he released his spirit into the embrace of the one he had sought all his life. When news of his death spread through the camp, a profound stillness overtook the suffering soldiers. Many knelt in the dust, weeping not only for a king lost, but for a father, a shepherd, a man whose holiness had shone more brightly than any crown. And beyond the camp, across the sea, in the distant fields and villages of France, hearts would soon tremble with grief, yet also with the quiet certainty that their king had walked the path of sacrifice to its very end, offering even his death as a final gift of love. And so, in that desolate encampment near Tunis, beneath a sky shimmering with heat and sorrow, a gentle question rose into the hearts of those who mourned him. What becomes of a kingdom, and of the world, when a saintly king lays down his life in the dust of a faraway land, leaving behind a legacy woven not of victories, but of humility, justice, and unwavering faith, flowing gently from the stillness that settled over the camp after Louis's final breath, drifted softly into eternity. The days that followed unfolded with a hush, as profound as grief itself. It was as though the air around the tents grew thicker, weighted by both sorrow and reverence, and the soldiers moved with a quiet solemnity, aware that they had witnessed something far greater than the death of a king. They had witnessed the passing of a soul who had walked among them with the humility of a servant and the courage of a saint. Even the wind that swept across the camp seemed to whisper with a gentler tone, carrying away the last echoes of his prayer. Louis had come to Tunis as a pilgrim king, offering the final strength of his life to God, and now he lay in the fragile stillness of death, his body weakened but his legacy shining with an inner radiance that no illness could diminish. The men who had followed Louis gathered around his body, many of them in tears. These were hardened soldiers who had braved storms, battles, and disease, yet in the face of their king's passing they felt like children, vulnerable, bereft, overwhelmed by the tenderness of a grief they could not contain. Some knelt in prayer, whispering psalms with trembling voices. Others simply sat in silence, their eyes fixed on the face that had guided them with unwavering gentleness. Louis's features, even in death, seemed softened by peace. The lines of suffering that illness had carved into his brow now appeared like marks of divine favor, the final traces of a life poured out completely. His hands, once strong and steady, now lay motionless, still lightly clasping the crucifix that had been his constant companion. In those hands, the soldiers saw not the power of a king, but the surrender of a soul who had loved God with every breath. Soon, the entire camp was enveloped in mourning. The banners that once fluttered in the hot wind were lowered to half-mast, and the bustle of daily labor quieted into a subdued rhythm as preparations were made to honor Louis's body. No one spoke of victory or defeat. No one spoke of strategy or alliances. All thoughts were turned toward the man who had walked among them with a grace that had touched even the hardest hearts. His death was not simply the loss of a leader. It was the closing of a chapter written in humility, sacrifice, and faithfulness. A chapter that had shaped their lives, often without them realizing it. The question soon arose of how to return the king's body to France. It was a delicate matter, complicated by the climate, the distance, and the fragile political circumstances surrounding the crusade. Yet those closest to Louis knew that he must be carried home. Not only because he was king, but because the people of France loved him with a devotion that stretched far beyond the boundaries of politics. They deserved the chance to mourn him, to honor him, to lay to rest the man who had given everything for their sake. And so preparations began with a reverence that made even the most arduous tasks feel like sacred duties. Louis's son, Prince Philip, now inheriting the responsibilities of kingship in the very shadow of his father's death, stood beside the body with a solemnity far beyond his years. He had admired his father deeply and learned from his example in ways that would shape his own reign. Yet in that moment, he was simply a grieving son, struggling to comprehend the immensity of the loss. Philip bowed his head in prayer, asking God for strength to carry forward the legacy entrusted to him. He felt both a heavy grief and a quiet resolve settle within him, as though his father's final breath had ushered him into a new life of responsibility. And beside him stood his brothers and companions, each carrying their own weight of sorrow, each wondering how the world would continue without the gentle presence that had anchored it for so long. The process of preparing Louis's body for the journey was slow and painstaking, carried out with deep reverence. Clerics prayed over him, chanting psalms and litanies that rose softly into the desert air. The soldiers kept vigil through the night, taking turns so that someone was always at his side, as though afraid to leave him alone even for a moment. Some recalled memories of Louis tending the sick, walking barefoot among the poor, praying in darkness, or comforting them when fear threatened to overwhelm their courage. These memories, once scattered across the years of his reign, now gathered together in their hearts, like golden threads woven into a tapestry that revealed the quiet holiness of his life. When the time came to begin the journey, the camp broke into a solemn procession. Louis's body, placed with care upon a bier, was carried by the hands of those who loved him most. The sun shone harshly upon the desert sands, yet even the heat seemed muted by the gravity of the moment. Step by slow step, they began the long journey towards the coast, their hearts heavy, their minds filled with prayers, their spirits anchored by the memory of the man they now mourned. Each footfall seemed to echo with significance, as though the earth itself recognized the passing of a soul who had walked with integrity through every hardship. Some wept openly, others let tears fall silently, but no one walked without feeling the deep reverberations of grief and gratitude. When the body reached the ships, preparations were made for the voyage back to France. The sailors, often hardened by life at sea, stood in respectful silence as the bier was brought aboard, their faces shadowed by the knowledge that they now carried the earthly remains of a king whose holiness had touched even distant shores. Before departure, a final prayer was offered, a litany of gratitude for Louis's life, a plea for God's mercy, and a blessing upon the journey ahead. As the ship pulled away from the coast, the soldiers and companions who remained behind watched in silence, their eyes fixed on the vessel as it slipped steadily across the water, carrying with it the precious weight of a life given completely. The journey back to France was long and filled with moments of reflection. Those on board spoke softly among themselves, sharing memories of the king who had been both their ruler and their brother in faith. They spoke of his kindness, his justice, his unshakable trust in God, and the way he had embraced suffering not as punishment, but as a path to deeper love. Each memory became a thread of consolation, weaving together a sense of peace even amid the profound grief that accompanied them. As the ship approached the shores of France, word of Louis's death had already begun to spread. Villages, towns, and cities waited in solemn anticipation, preparing to receive their king with honor and reverence. When the vessel finally docked, crowds gathered along the coastline, falling to their knees as the bier was carried ashore. They reached out not to touch the body, but to let their prayers touch the air around it. Bells tolled across the land their mournful voices echoing through valleys and along cobblestone streets. France, which had known both turmoil and peace beneath Louis's gentle rule, now felt the weight of collective loss descend upon it like a heavy veil. In Paris, the procession continued through streets lined with mourners. Even those who had once criticized Louis's piety now found themselves moved by his death. They recognized, perhaps more clearly than ever, that his devotion had not been weakness, but strength, the quiet, unyielding strength of a man who sought to follow Christ in every breath, every decision, every act of love. His body was laid to rest with solemn ceremony, accompanied by prayers spoken through tears. And in the hearts of the people, a realization took root. They had not simply buried a king, they had honored a saint. And as the final prayers rose gently into the air, a question lingered softly in the minds of all who gathered. How would the memory of this gentle, just, and holy king continue to shape the soul of France, guiding future generations toward the light he had followed so faithfully, flowing gently from the solemn return of Louis's body to France, and the deep mourning that swept through the kingdom? The years that followed became a time of remembrance, healing, and reflection, not only for the grieving nation, but for all of Christendom. For even as the physical presence of the king faded into the quiet rest of the tomb, the memory of his goodness lingered like a gentle light that refused to dim. In villages and cities alike, people spoke of Louis not as a distant monarch, but as a man whose humble heart had touched their lives in ways both visible and hidden. Stories circulated, stories of justice rendered with compassion, of alms discreetly given, of prayers whispered in silence, and of a king who knelt before the altar with the sincerity of a child, but governed with the wisdom of a shepherd. These stories wove themselves into the collective memory of France, forming a tapestry of gratitude that would endure long after the grief of his passing softened into peace. Louis's legacy unfolded not in grand monuments or military triumphs, though his reign had brought peace and stability, but in the quiet transformation of the nation's conscience. He had taught France to see justice not as an abstract principle, but as a sacred duty entrusted to every soul in authority. He had shown that charity must be the foundation of governance, that the poor and the forgotten were treasures to be cherished rather than burdens to be ignored. And he had reminded his people that holiness wasn't reserved for monks and clergy, but was a calling for all, including kings and laborers, nobles and servants. In this way, Louis reshaped the very identity of French leadership, leaving behind a model that future rulers would strive, and sometimes fail, to emulate. In the months following his burial, King Philip, still young and newly burdened with the full weight of responsibility, sought guidance from the memory of his father's example. He walked through the same palace corridors where Louis had prayed and pondered decisions, and he found himself pausing in the chapel where his father had spent long hours seeking God's will. Philip, though different in temperament, carried within him the imprint of Louis's teachings, lessons absorbed in childhood and now tested in the crucible of governance. Advisors noticed a new seriousness in him, a maturity shaped as much by grief as by duty. Though he would never mirror Louis's intense piety, Philip embraced the values of justice, fairness, and responsibility that his father had embodied. And in his own way, he continued the work of shaping a kingdom grounded in moral strength. Beyond the royal household, Louis's influence radiated into the fabric of French society. Monasteries and churches that he had supported with generosity now became centers of prayer offered for his soul. Monks spoke of him with admiration, reflecting upon the depth of his devotion and his willingness to unite suffering with sacrifice. The poor remembered him as a friend, recalling the days when he had walked barefoot among them, sharing bread and listening to their concerns with a compassion rarely seen in the powerful. Widows and orphans remembered the alms discreetly given, the protection extended to them when they had no one else to defend them. And soldiers remembered the quiet courage he had shown in the Holy Land, a courage made all the more extraordinary because it was rooted not in conquest, but in faith. In time, word of Louis's sanctity spread beyond the borders of France. Pilgrims from distant lands traveled to Paris to visit the places where he had prayed, ruled, and served. Stories of miracles attributed to his intercession began to circulate. Stories of healings, of prayers answered, of lives changed through his spiritual presence. Some approached these accounts with skepticism, others with awe. But the stories continued, carried by the faith of those who believed that Louis, even in death, remained close to the hearts of those who sought God's mercy through him. The Church, attentive to the growing devotion surrounding Louis's memory, began to investigate his life with rigorous care. Clergy examined his writings, his decisions, his habits of prayer, his relationship with the poor, his acts of penance, and the way he balanced kingship with humility. Witnesses testified to his devotion to the Eucharist, his unwavering honesty, his gentle spirit, and his ability to forgive even those who had betrayed or criticized him. They spoke of his daily discipline, his constant prayer, and his desire to conform his life to Christ in every way. Scholars studied his reforms, noting how he had strengthened justice without oppression, and how he had fostered peace without surrendering integrity. And as the Church weighed the evidence, a picture emerged, not merely of a good king, but of a man whose life bore the unmistakable marks of sanctity. In 1297, just 27 years after his death, Pope Boniface VIII canonized Louis as Saint Louis, recognizing formally what the people of France had known in their hearts from the moment his soul departed the world. His canonization was not the triumph of a political figure, but the celebration of a servant of God, a man who had lived holiness not as an ideal, but as a daily act of love, discipline, and sacrifice. The day his sainthood was proclaimed, churches across Europe rang their bells in joy. Sons and daughters of France wept with gratitude, feeling as though their king had been returned to them in a new and radiant way. St. Louis became not only a national patron, but a beacon for rulers, a model for those who sought to unite leadership with humility. His feast day would be celebrated for centuries, a gentle reminder that power can indeed serve love, that authority can kneel before God, and that holiness can flourish even within the demanding duties of kingship. St. Louis's influence, however, did not remain confined to France or the medieval era. His example stretched across generations, inspiring reformers, leaders, and ordinary believers who sought to align their lives more closely with the teachings of Christ. Cathedrals, schools, and cities would bear his name, most famously the city of St. Louis in the New World, each one echoing his legacy in its own way. Writers and historians reflected upon his life with admiration, weaving his memory into the broader narrative of Christian history. He became known not merely as a saint, but as an embodiment of the ideal Christian ruler. Firm in justice, tender in charity, courageous in faith, and humble in spirit. Yet perhaps the deepest impact of his life lay not in monuments, stories, or titles, but in the quiet transformation of hearts. Those who encountered his story, whether in the Middle Ages or centuries later, found themselves moved by the simple truth that holiness is possible for anyone who seeks God with sincerity. Louis had been a king, Yet he had lived with the soul of a pilgrim, always seeking, always surrendering, always returning to prayer. His life reminded believers that sanctity is not reserved for the cloistered or the scholarly. It is available to all who choose mercy over pride, service over power, and love over ambition. And so, as the memory of St. Louis spread across lands and centuries, a gentle question began to settle within the hearts of those who reflected upon his life. In a world often shaped by ambition and unrest, how might the quiet integrity of a saintly king continue to guide the souls of those who yearn for justice, humility, and peace? Flowing gently from the reverent glow of his canonization and the enduring warmth of a people who saw in him not only a monarch but a mirror of the gospel, the story of St. Louis IX enters its final reflective movement, the quiet unfolding of a legacy that stretches far beyond the constraints of his own century. For what remains after a saint's earthly life is not simply memory, nor just admiration, but an invitation, an open, living path calling each soul to consider its own journey toward God. And so, as the centuries turned and the world shifted through eras of war, peace, change, and renewal, the example of St. Louis lingered like a steady flame, illuminating the way for rulers and common folk alike, whispering through history the possibility that holiness can be lived in every station of life, even upon the trembling heights of a throne. In the years following his canonization, devotions to St. Louis flourished throughout France and well beyond. Pilgrims traveled from afar to pray at the places where he had lived, served, and loved. Churches dedicated to him began to rise, becoming havens where the poor found comfort, the weary found peace, and the hopeful found encouragement. Artists carved his likeness with a tender solemnity, a crowned king holding a scepter in one hand and a cross in the other, the subtle message clear, that in him power and humility had become inseparable. Yet beneath the beauty of statues and cathedral windows lay something far more enduring, the sense that St. Louis was not merely a figure to be admired, but a companion for the spiritual journey, a friend for every soul seeking to love God more deeply. What made his sainthood so resonant, even centuries later, was the simplicity of his path. He did not become holy through dramatic visions or extraordinary miracles. He became holy through daily fidelity, in prayer that steadied his heart when the world trembled, in justice that defended the vulnerable, in charity that flowed quietly through prisons, hospitals, and humble homes, and in the humility with which he accepted both triumph and defeat. His life revealed that sanctity grows not from rare, dazzling moments, but from countless acts of love offered quietly and faithfully. And in this, he became a model not only for kings, but for parents, workers, teachers, rulers, and all who carry burdens of responsibility. His example also reshaped Christian thought regarding leadership. In St. Louis, the Church recognized a man who governed with a conscience formed by the gospel. He did not separate his faith from his duty. He allowed it to saturate his decisions, his relationships, and his policies. He understood that justice was not merely a social principle, but a spiritual one, and that those in authority carry a sacred obligation to steward the lives entrusted to them. For rulers and leaders across the centuries, his legacy became a quiet yet profound challenge, to wield influence not as domination, but as service, not as privilege, but as an opportunity to reflect the mercy of Christ. And yet, St. Louis's influence was not confined to rulers or statesmen. Ordinary believers found in his life a source of comfort. They saw in him a reminder that suffering, when united to faith, becomes a path of grace. His imprisonment, his failures, his illnesses, none of these diminished him. Instead, they shaped him into a man whose love for God grew deeper because it had been tested. Those who felt overwhelmed by hardship saw in him the truth that holiness is forged not in ease, but in the quiet endurance of trials offered to God. Through his journey, the weary found reassurance that no pain is wasted in the hands of divine mercy. In the centuries that followed, as France endured its own cycles of turbulence and rebirth, the memory of St. Louis remained a stabilizing force. During wars, his name was invoked as a protector. During times of moral uncertainty, his example was recalled as a compass. During national celebrations, he was honored as a symbol of integrity. This continued relevance spoke not of nostalgia, but of the enduring power of virtue lived with sincerity. His life became a chapter in the spiritual heritage of the nation, one that whispered gently to each generation that holiness is not beyond reach, but is as near as the next act of kindness, the next moment of courage, the next prayer lifted humbly to heaven. Beyond France, the story of St. Louis reached across oceans. Missionaries carried his name to distant lands, establishing schools, hospitals, and churches under his patronage. One day, across the vast Atlantic, a new city would rise in the heart of North America, St. Louis, a testament to the global resonance of his legacy. This city, in time, would become a place of learning, culture, and faith, its name echoing the memory of a king who had devoted his life to God. And in this unexpected way, St. Louis became a bridge between worlds, a saint whose example traveled far beyond the borders he once governed. Yet as his influence deepened, so too did the more personal impact of his life, the quiet, inner transformation experienced by those who reflected upon his journey. People found themselves drawn not to the image of a perfect king, but to the story of a man who struggled, who doubted, who suffered, and who chose again and again to place his trust in God. They found solace in the knowledge that holiness is not the absence of fear or failure, but the willingness to take one more step toward God each day. They discovered that the path of St. Louis was, at its core, the path of a disciple, a journey marked by conversion, surrender, and love. Over time, spiritual writers began to describe St. Louis's life as a kind of pilgrimage, one that began in the halls of a royal palace and ended in the dust of a foreign land, yet was guided at every step by the pursuit of Christ. They reflected on how he had moved from youthful ambition to mature faith, from the battlefield to the bedside of the dying, from the throne to the prison cell, from the comforts of home to the harsh desert near Tunis. These reflections helped believers understand their own lives as pilgrimages, journeys shaped by seasons of peace and seasons of trial, all leading toward the same eternal destination to which St. Louis had surrendered his final breath. As the centuries carried his memory forward, the question St. Louis posed to the world grew more gentle, yet more urgent. How will you live your own call to holiness? For in the end, his life was not a monument of admiration, but an invitation to imitation. He did not seek to be remembered as a perfect king, but as a humble servant of God. And so his story continues to whisper to every heart that longs for meaning. Holiness is possible. Fidelity is possible. Surrender is possible. It is possible for kings and for shepherds, for scholars and for workers, for rulers and for the forgotten, for anyone who chooses to offer their life, day by day, to the quiet work of love. And thus, as the gentle echo of St. Louis's journey reaches across time, It invites each listener to consider one final question, a question that rises softly from the depths of his legacy and settles like a blessing upon the soul. If a king, burdened with power and responsibility, could choose the narrow path of humility and find God there, how might your own life unfold if you, too, chose to walk that sacred path of justice, compassion, and unwavering faith?